The ocean is vast and unforgiving. It's said that we know more about space than we do about our own oceans. They certainly have secrets that will never be explained. These are some stories that still hold some mystery. You may have already seen some of these as individual stories on this channel, so use the chapters in the description below to navigate the stories in this compilation. Safety standards for the US Navy's nuclear submarine training program are written in the blood of the submariners on Thresher. The sailors followed their standard operating procedures into a cascade of failures, plummeting to the depths of the Atlantic. Thresher is the fastest and quietest submarine of its day, matching the smaller contemporary Skipjack class. It's created to find and destroy Soviet submarines. It has the most advanced weapons system, including launchers for the US Navy's newest anti-submarine missile, Subrock. It also has passive and active sonar that can detect vessels at unprecedented range. It's the first of a new class of nuclear-powered submarines, combining the attributes of an attack submarine and a specialized hunter-killer craft. The submarine has a cigar-shaped hull for efficient underwater performance based on the research submarine Albacore AGSS 569. In its bow is the massive BQQ-2 sonar, which is the most advanced sonar ever fitted to a submarine. The Thresher's 4 torpedo tubes sit behind the sonar, 2 on each side, angled out at 10 degrees from the centerline. They can fire the latest anti-ship and anti-submarine torpedoes, and at a later stage will be refitted to fire the ASROC anti-submarine rockets. ASROC is a combination rocket and torpedo. It's launched like a conventional torpedo, shoots to the surface, leaves the water on a ballistic trajectory, and plunges back into the water at the target site where the nuclear warhead detonates. The submarine's S5W nuclear reactor plant gives it unlimited range. Its pressure hull, constructed of HY80 steel, enables it to dive to 400 meters. Following Navy tradition, the class of subs is originally named Thresher after the first boat. The contract to build Thresher is awarded to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard on the east coast of the US. Its keel is laid on the 28th of May 1958. It's launched on the 9th of July 1960 and is commissioned on the 3rd of August 1961 under Commander Dean Axine. Thresher conducts lengthy sea trials in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean seas throughout 1961 and 1962. These tests allow a thorough evaluation of its many new and complex technological features and weapons. It takes part in nuclear submarine exercise New Sub-X 3-61 off the northeastern coast of the United States from the 18th to the 24th of September 1961. On the 18th of October 61, Thresher and diesel-electric submarine Cavella head south on a 3-week test and training cruise to San Juan, Puerto Rico, arriving on the 2nd of November. The nuclear reactor is shut down while in port. No shore power connection is available in San Juan, so the ship's backup diesel generator is used to carry the electrical loads while in port. After several hours, the backup generator breaks down and the electrical load is transferred to the ship's battery. Most of the battery power is needed to keep vital systems operating and to restart the reactor, so lighting and air conditioning are shut down. Without air conditioning, the temperature and humidity in the submarine rises to as high as 60 degrees Celsius after 10 hours, while the crew tries to repair the diesel generator. It becomes clear that the generator won't be fixed before the battery runs down, so the crew tries to restart the reactor, but the battery charge is already too low. The captain returns to the ship from a shore function just after the battery goes dead. The crew borrows a cable from another ship in the harbor and connects to Cavella, which provides enough power to allow Thresher to jumpstart her reactor. Thresher conducts further trials and fires test torpedoes before returning to Portsmouth on the 29th of November. The boat remains in port through the end of the year and spends the first 2 months of 1962 with its sonar and subrock systems under evaluation. In March, it takes part in New Sub-X 2-62, which is an exercise to improve the tactical capabilities of nuclear submarines and anti-submarine warfare training with Task Group Alpha. Off Charleston, South Carolina, Thresher undertakes operations supporting the development of the Subrock anti-submarine missile. It returns briefly to New England, then heads to Florida for more Subrock tests. In Port Canaveral, a tugboat accidentally hits the sub, damaging one of its ballast tanks. After being repaired at Groton, Connecticut by the Electric Boat Company, Thresher heads south for more tests and trials off Key West, then returns north. It enters Portsmouth Shipyard on the 16th of July 62 for a scheduled 6-month maintenance program. One of the systems they need to check over carefully is the ballast system, which has been repaired after being hit by the tug. In order to service the system, the engineers install temporary strainers in the pipes to protect the valves. These strainers block contaminants from entering the pipework while the system is open. The work takes longer than expected, and nearly 9 months later, the ship is finally recertified and undocked on the 8th of April 1963. On Tuesday the 9th of April at 0800, Thresher, under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey, departs from Kittery, Maine. It meets up with the submarine rescue ship Skylark at 1100 to begin its initial post-overhaul dive trials. Together, they sail to an area about 100 nautical miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. During its 2 years of service, it's already been to its test depth about 40 times. In the afternoon, Thresher conducts an initial trim dive test, surfaces, then performs a second dive to 200 meters deep, which is half its test depth, where it remains submerged overnight. The next day, Wednesday the 10th of April at 0630, Thresher re-establishes underwater communications with Skylark and sets about preparing for deep dive trials. At 0747, it starts to descend to the test depth of 400 meters. 5 minutes later, it levels off at 220 meters and contacts the surface while the crew inspect the ship for leaks. No leaks are found, and Thresher continues its dive. At 0825, it reaches 300 meters. Submarines typically rely on speed and deck angle, or their angle of attack, to ascend or descend. Much like a plane that alters the angle of its elevator to point the nose up or down, a submarine uses the angle of its diving planes and is propelled at an angle toward the surface or into a dive. If the sub is going fast and the diving planes jam when it's already at its test depth, it could send the ship below that depth in a matter of seconds. So submarines normally move slowly and cautiously at depth. The boat is descending in slow circles and announces to Skylark that it's turning to Korpen 090, which means it will turn to a heading of 90 degrees on the compass. Transmission quality from Thresher starts to deteriorate as they pass through a thermocline. Water in the ocean is not always the same temperature. Sometimes you have one warm layer of water floating on top of a cold layer of water. A thermocline is the point where they meet. It's as distinct as putting your arm down through the thermocline and your hand being in cold water while your body is in warmer water. The change in temperature also changes the speed of the radio waves, and the turbulence between the two temperatures of water disrupts the signal. Just after 9, Thresher is cruising at only a few knots. Right here, there are two diverging interpretations of the data. One relies on information from testing and failures on other submarines, while the other relies on sound recordings in the ocean on that day. They both arrive at the same conclusion, but take different paths to get there. Based on the information from testing and experience on other submarines, the official report finds that at 0909, a pipe joint ruptures in the engine room. This same type of joint has failed previously on other ships using the same type of connection. Two pipes are joined using silver brazing, like soldering two copper pipes instead of a weld. Salt water from the reactor cooling pipe floods the engine room. The crew tries in vain to stop the leak while the engine room fills with a cloud of mist. On the other side of the engine room, water leaking from the broken pipe causes a short circuit in the electrics, and the water pump providing cold water to cool the nuclear reactor shuts down. USS Abraham Lincoln suffered pipes leaking from brazed pipe joints during trials, and USS Babel suffers silver braze joint failure near test depth while on an exercise. The engine room in USS Babel floods with almost 18 tons of water in the 3 minutes it takes to surface under power and with blown ballast tanks. In another scenario based on acoustic recordings, SOSUS, or Sound Surveillance Systems, records 2 minutes of electrical instability, and the electrical bus powering the main cooling pump fails at 0911, causing the cooling pump to trip. In the recordings, there's no sound of flooding water or a burst pipe. At that depth, the seawater spraying into the submarine would be under a huge amount of pressure. That type of spray creates a very specific sound wave which isn't present in the recordings. This SOSUS data was classified during the initial court inquiry and was only declassified in 2013, so wasn't entered into evidence or analyzed at the time of the incident in 1963. Commander Harvey orders full speed, full rise on the diving planes and to blow the main ballast to surface. Blowing the main ballast will fill the ballast tanks with air, creating positive buoyancy. While the ship normally uses only the diving planes to angle its direction to the surface, the additional positive buoyancy from the ballast will ensure a rapid ascent. High-pressure cylinders in Thresher hold compressed air. In order to replace water in the ballast tanks, the compressed air is released into the ballast tanks, forcing water out and replacing it with air. But when you open a valve like the ballast tank valve, air rapidly passes through the pipes. The air cools to the point that it causes condensation in the pipes to freeze. That's not normally a problem because as the high-pressure air flows, it washes away any ice deposits. But now, the temporary strainers installed in the system to protect the moving parts of the valves during maintenance block the flow of air to the point that the pipes freeze over. These strainers should have been removed before sea trials. In just a few seconds, the moisture freezes, clogging the strainers and blocking the airflow, stopping the effort to blow ballast. Because the main cooling pump has shut down, the ship's nuclear reactor automatically shuts down to protect itself. When a nuclear reactor automatically shuts down in an emergency, it's called a scram. Thresher has no propulsion and no ballast control. Commander Harvey orders propulsion shifted to a battery-powered backup system. The engine room crew try to fix the pump and then turn their attention to restarting the reactor, which will take at least 7 minutes. The last time a nuclear submarine lost power in a controlled training environment, it took 20 minutes to restart. Jim Henry is a trainee reactor control officer on his first patrol, fresh from nuclear power school. He's standing in for Thresher's reactor control officer, Lieutenant Raymond McCool, who's on shore leave. Trainee Henry follows standard operating procedures and gives the order to isolate the steam system after the reactor scram, even though Thresher's around its maximum depth. The nuclear reactor heats water which turns to steam. Water expands 1,600 times in volume when it turns to steam. The pressure that creates is channeled through a turbine which converts that energy into propulsion and electricity. Some of that steam is captured in a secondary chamber and released as needed. Reactor plant operating procedures don't allow for a rapid reactor restart following a scram, nor the ability to use steam remaining in the secondary system to propel the submarine to the surface. The system must cool down and then be restarted. After a scram, standard operating procedure is to isolate the main steam system, cutting off the flow of steam to the turbines providing propulsion and electricity. After it's closed, the large steam system isolation valves can't be reopened quickly. These procedures are for normal operating conditions. They're not intended to restrict emergency actions involving the safety of the ship. Had he been there, perhaps an experienced officer like Lieutenant McCool would have kept the valves open and used the excess steam in the secondary system to propel the submarine to the surface. At 0912, Skylark pages Thresher using the signal K. K is the signal used to tell another vessel you wish to communicate with them. Skylark is not aware of the conditions on board Thresher. They repeat the signal K twice. At 0913, Harvey reports their status via underwater telephone. The transmission is garbled, but some words are clear. We're experiencing minor difficulty, have positive up angle, trying to blow. Officers on Skylark hear the hiss of compressed air in the background. Skylark acknowledges with a quick "Roger, out," and waits for further updates from the submarine. They send a follow-up message, "No contacts in area." This message is sent to reassure Thresher that it can surface fast because there's nothing in the area they could possibly collide with. At 0915, Skylark asks Thresher to confirm its position relative to Skylark, but there's no response. Skylark's captain, Lieutenant Commander Hecker, now asks a more direct question. Are you in control? A minute later, Skylark picks up a garbled transmission from Thresher, which is written in the ship's log as 900N. It might indicate the submarine's depth and course, or it might mean N as a negative answer to the question from Skylark, are you in control? A second transmission follows with the partially clear phrase, exceeding test depth. At 0918, Skylark detects a high-energy, low-frequency noise characteristic of an implosion. The estimated depth is 730 meters, almost double Thresher's test depth. The implosion takes 0.1 seconds, too fast for the human nervous system to perceive. Skylark continues to send messages to Thresher, repeatedly calling for a radio check, a smoke bomb, or some other sign of the boat's condition. At 11:04, almost 2 hours since their last contact, Skylark tries to transmit a message to ComSubLance, the commander of submarines for the Atlantic Fleet. Can't communicate with Thresher since 0917. Have been calling every minute. Explosive signals every 10 minutes with no success. Last transmission received is garbled. Indicates Thresher is approaching test depth. Conducting expanding search. Radio problems mean that ComSubLance doesn't receive and respond to this message until 12:45. Lieutenant Commander Hecker initiates Event Submiss loss of a submarine procedures at 11:21 and continues to repeatedly hail Thresher until 1700. At 18:30, the commander of the Submarine Force Atlantic sends word to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard to start notifying the crew's family members, starting with Commander Harvey's wife Irene, that Thresher is missing. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George Anderson Jr. goes before the press corps at the Pentagon and announces that the submarine is lost with all hands. President John F. Kennedy orders all flags to be flown at half-staff from the 12th to the 15th of April in honor of the 129 lost submariners and shipyard personnel. From 1915 to 1963, the U.S. Navy lost 16 submarines in non-combat accidents. Following this incident, the Navy implements a program called SubSafe, which is a more rigorous program of design review and safety inspections during construction. Since the implementation of SubSafe, only one submarine has been lost in similar circumstances. Air dryers are later retrofitted to the high-pressure air compressors in submarines to help eliminate ice buildup. Standard operating procedures are altered for fast recovery startup. This allows an immediate reactor restart and for steam from the secondary system to be used in limited quantities for several minutes following a scram. Having been lost at sea, Thresher is not decommissioned by the US Navy and remains on eternal patrol. The crew of a sword fishing boat from Gloucester, Massachusetts are heading home with a hold full of fish. They decide to motor straight through a storm. They don't have time to go around. Their deck is heavily laden with barrels of drinking water and extra fuel. Their ice machine isn't working and they need to land their catch. What they don't know is that the Andrea Gail is sailing into what will become the worst storm for 100 years. Some would say, the perfect storm. The Andrea Gail was a steel-hulled Western rig fishing ship, mainly used for catching North Atlantic swordfish. Western rigs are fishing boats with a square stern, a steep angled bow, and a flat deck at the back. The crew do most of their work on the deck at the back. The captain stays in the pilot house, which is at the front of the ship. Western rigs fish for swordfish by long lining, where 40-mile-long fishing lines with as many as 1,000 baited hooks are trailed behind the ship. Ships fish for weeks at a time and catch tens of thousands of pounds of swordfish every trip. In 1987, the ship was modified to store extra fuel on deck. The stern was extended by almost a meter and the portside bulwark or sidewall was raised by almost a meter. The stability of the ship isn't reviewed after the modifications. Gloucester, Massachusetts is the Andrea Gail's home port. Gloucester is over 400 years old with a rich maritime history. The first settlers were men from an English vessel who decided to stay instead of returning home after fishing nearby in the Atlantic. Fishing developed in Gloucester after these first arrivals, becoming an organized industry towards the end of the 17th century. As early as 1711, Gloucester fishermen were found fishing as far away as Cape Sable in Nova Scotia in their wooden sailboats. In the 1990s, when the Andrea Gail set out on its final voyage, a third of all Gloucester jobs were fishing related. The Gloucester Fishermen's Memorial was built in 1925 to celebrate the city's 300th anniversary and to honor the lives of the city's many fishermen who've been lost at sea. At least 4,000 Gloucester men are known to have died fishing, but it's thought that number could be as high as 10,000. Between 1860 and 1906, 660 ships sank in the North Atlantic. In those days, a storm could sink an entire fleet in one go. It's mid-September 1991, and the crew of the Andrea Gail are preparing to depart from Gloucester Harbour on a fishing trip. Modern ships like the Andrea Gail can sail huge distances and spend long periods of time at sea. This ship will fish over 1,000 miles away at the Grand Banks. This is a shallow area 90 miles southeast of Newfoundland where warm water from the Gulf Stream meets cold water from the Labrador Sea. Swordfish like feeding in the shallow waters, and this makes it popular with the fishermen of Gloucester. The crew carry enough supplies for a 40 to 50 day trip, and they plan to land a catch that will earn them a lot of money. Deckhands can make $10,000 in one trip. Boats like the Andrea Gail can make as much as $500,000 profit in a year. Before the ship departs, Linda Greenlaw, the captain of the Andrea Gail's sister ship, the Hannah Bowden, gives the Andrea Gail extra fuel and bait so they can last longer at sea. They're going to make sure they land a good catch. The Andrea Gail is captained by Frank William Tyne Jr., and the ship has a full crew of 6 men. Tyne goes by his nickname Billy. Billy Tyne is 37 years old. He has a year's experience on the Andrea Gail with 3 months as the ship's captain. Before the Andrea Gail, he has over 10 years of fishing experience with 5 years as a captain. Tyne was born and raised in Gloucester, but he wasn't always a fisherman. Before fishing, he was a carpenter and a drug counselor, but he gave that up when he was 27 for the chance to earn big money in sword fishing. Around the time he took up fishing, he married Jody Tyne, and together they had 2 daughters, Erica and Billy Jo. Tyne found he was a natural fisherman, and by the late 1980s, he'd become one of the most successful captains in the Gloucester sword fishing fleet. He and Jody divorced in 1990. Fishing is a single man's game. Crews will often fish for a month at a time, and sometimes they'll only be home for a week. The danger and stress also puts strain on relationships, and lots of Gloucester fishermen are divorced. Billy and Jody did get divorced, but they reconciled and formulated a plan to move to Hawaii with the hope that the safer fishing in Hawaii will put less strain on their relationship. This is Billy Tyne's last trip from Gloucester before they go. Before he leaves, he has a 3-hour phone call with Jody. They talk about their upcoming move to Hawaii and about taking their daughters to Disney World. Conditions can be tough in the Atlantic around September. The summer's over and the weather's getting colder. Working outside on a ship's deck is much more difficult in the winter. The crew have to work through strong winds, heavy rain, and cold temperatures, morning, day, and night. They work whenever they can fish. The sea's getting colder and people don't survive for long if they go overboard. Storms are also a threat, with a history of ships lost to powerful storms. The Andrea Gail is a large, strong ship. The owner, Bob Brown, thinks there isn't a storm that could sink it, and Tyne is known as a brave sailor who'll safely sail ships like the Andrea Gail through any North Atlantic storm. And they're prepared for an emergency. The ship has survival suits for all the crew members, a 6-person life raft, an emergency position indicating radio beacon or EPIRB, 2 VHF FM radios, a single sideband radio, a GPS system, radar, and 2 weather receivers. The ship's ready and it departs Gloucester on the 20th of September 1991. It's heavily loaded. 2 additional fuel tanks that are added to the ship's stern in 1987 are full. Between them, they carry an extra 3,800 gallons of fuel. That's on top of the fuel in the 2 original 1,000-gallon fuel tanks in the engine room. The vessel also has 30 additional 55-gallon fuel drums stored on deck. 2,000 gallons of drinking water are stored in the ship's integrated water tanks, and 10 extra 55-gallon plastic drums of drinking water are stored on deck with the extra fuel. Carrying extra drums of fuel and water isn't unusual for a ship like this, but the Andrea Gail is heavily loaded and sailing slightly low in the water as it leaves Gloucester Harbour. It takes nearly a week for the Andrea Gail to sail to the Grand Banks, where they'll start their fishing. During the passage, the crew get the fishing gear ready, eat, sleep, watch TV, and talk amongst themselves. They fish hard at the Grand Banks in tough conditions. When they're fishing, the crew work all the hours they can manage. They spend their evenings late into the night baiting their lines with up to 1,000 hooks by hand and putting out as much as 40 miles of line. It takes until midnight to set the line, then they wake at 4 in the morning to bring it back in. They hardly sleep, and in the rough Atlantic Ocean, they rock restlessly in their bunks. Bringing the 40-mile line in is hard work. A swordfish can weigh up to 1,000 pounds, and they have to be dragged onto the ship with hooks. Their day is spent butchering and icing the fish, organizing the fishing gear, and keeping the boat running. They cook, eat, and shower whenever they can steal a moment. By midnight, the line is set and baited, and so the cycle repeats itself. Their pay is hard fought. The 5 deckhands Tyne has on his ship are a mixture of both seasoned fishermen and less experienced greenhorns. The captain, Billy Tyne, lives on Gloucester Avenue, just around the corner from the Sullivan family. Tyne recruited David Sully Sullivan to work on the ship after Adam Randall dropped out at the last minute. Randall cheated death this time, but is later lost at sea on a different boat, the Terry Lee. Billy Tyne is close friends with Sullivan's older brother Mark. Sully is the most recent hire on the Andrea Gail and the youngest member of the crew at 29. Sully's sister Kathy says he's got guts and loves fishing. Some months earlier, Sully was on the fishing boat Harmony when it started taking on water in the middle of the night. The crew of the Harmony called to another ship for help but couldn't rouse the sleeping crew. Sully dived into the icy water, swam to the other ship and woke the crew, who then helped them save the Harmony from sinking. At 30 years old, Robert Bobby Shatford is another one of the younger crew. Despite being less experienced than the rest of the crew, Shatford is already well known in the Gloucester fishing community. He's the son of Ethel Shatford Preston, who runs the Crow's Nest. Crow's Nest is the local watering hole. This is where the crew go to drink after a fishing trip and sometimes bunk down in their rooms. Like the other members of the crew, Shatford is drawn to fishing by the prospect of making big money from a good catch. No doubt influenced by the stories from fishermen in the Crow's Nest. Shatford has 2 young sons he'll leave behind in Gloucester. They're with their mother, Lisa Shatford O'Brien. The couple are already separated. Dale Murphy is also 30 years old. Originally from Bradenton Beach, Florida, Murphy leaves his 3-year-old son Dale behind with his ex-wife Deborah for this fishing trip. Murphy is the ship's cook on this undertaking. The other 2 members of the crew are Michael Bugsy Moran and Alfred Pierre. Moran is slightly older than the other crew at 36. Like Murphy, he's also from Bradenton Beach, Florida. Pierre is 32 from New York City. The Andrea Gail lost its cook from the previous 2 trips. Doug Costco decided not to go on this trip. a decision that saves his life. Costco is a friend of Tyne's. He signed up for 3 trips over the summer as the ship's cook. But on the second trip, he had a spiritual encounter with a swordfish that made him decide to give up swordfishing entirely. Near the end of the trip, Tyne calls Costco up on deck to help butcher and ice down a large catch. Costco's killed hundreds of swordfish without ever thinking about it, but this time he sees the colors in one particularly large swordfish. He later recalls, when you take them out of the water and they're still alive, they've got all these colors, more colors than the rainbow, and as they start to die, the colors fade away one by one. He says it looked up at him, and he knows it can see him. It's old, 10, 20 years. He's taken it out of its environment, and it's saying to him, please don't kill me, I have a family. Costco kills the fish, but he feels like he's had a connection with it, and he promises to himself that he'll never kill another swordfish again. After they reach port from that trip, Costco collects his pay and disappears. He couldn't face Billy or the rest of the crew at the Crow's Nest. He just got on a train and left. After learning about the fate of the Andrea Gail, Costco started having a recurring dream that he was trapped inside the boat with his face pressed up against the porthole window, staring out into the abyss as the ship sinks deeper and deeper. The crew spend weeks fishing at the Grand Banks. They fish hard, setting the line, then bringing it in and day out. But luck is not on their side, and they have a poor catch at the Grand Banks. Tyne decides to change plans and sail the Andrea Gail almost 300 miles northeast to fish the Flemish Cap. This is another area of relatively shallow water popular with swordfish and fishermen. It's the 23rd of October and the moon is full in the night sky. The Andrea Gail is fishing the Flemish Cap and they finally start to bring in a big haul. A few days of successful fishing and they've got the catch they need. There's 40,000 pounds of storefish in the hold. This is a full load and it could be worth as much as $250,000. But there's a problem with their ice machine which isn't working properly. Without a functioning ice machine, they can't keep their catch frozen. They need to head back to land immediately or they risk losing their entire haul and the trip would be a waste of time and money. Billy Tyne decides to end the fishing trip and head home. The ship begins its return voyage to Gloucester on either the 26th or 27th of October. They've received warnings of a possible storm in the ship's path. An area of low pressure has been forming on land over southern Quebec. This cold front coming off the eastern side of North America looks like it might head out to sea and develop into a storm. Storms aren't uncommon at this time of year and Tyne expects the Andrea Gail will handle it. He starts the return journey and they steam directly towards Gloucester. On the 28th of October, the Andrea Gail is at the start of its journey towards Gloucester. Meteorologists have been monitoring the area of low pressure coming from Quebec. It's heading out to sea. They're also tracking a hurricane that's developed further south in the Atlantic. This hurricane started forming while the crew were catching swordfish at the Flemish Cap. It began as a mid-level area of low pressure to the south of Bermuda on the 23rd of October. By the 27th, it's developed into a hurricane and given the name Grace. Hurricane Grace heads north, but it doesn't pose an immediate threat. Hurricanes happen at this time of year. Normally they don't travel far north. They tend to make landfall in the southern United States. Over land, they burn themselves out. Tyne just needs to keep an eye on it. He also has more immediate things on his mind. A different storm is forming around them. The area of low pressure coming from Quebec is creating storm conditions out at sea to the east of Nova Scotia, in the precise path of the Andrea Gail. The Andrea Gail needs to navigate this storm to get home. The ship steams on towards Gloucester. The hurricane and the storm start to flirt with one another, but there's no suggestion that this is significant. Over the day of the 28th of October, Hurricane Grace continues moving northwards rather than going over land like hurricanes normally do. Hurricane Grace travels further north instead and meets the far western edge of the storm the Andrea Gail is sailing through. The cold front coming off the eastern side of North America that spawned the area of low pressure over Quebec is now blocking the hurricane from reaching land. Moisture from Hurricane Grace merges with the storm. Now the northern low-pressure system actually keeps the hurricane at bay. It influences the hurricane's path, turning it eastward and out towards the middle of the Atlantic. The Andrea Gail is safe from the hurricane and left to deal with only the storm. Tyne speaks to the crews of other fishing vessels in his area over the radio. He's coming from the north and is now in the middle of the storm. Tyne has sailed through storms before, but this one is powerful enough for him to give everyone a warning. He reports to the other ships that they're experiencing 10-meter waves and winds from 50 to 80 knots. It's a strong storm and the Andrea Gail is battling hard. He tells the other fishing boats, "She's coming on, boys, she's coming on strong." Tyne and his men have to battle the storm, but they believe they'll be okay. The experienced men know how to handle a storm, and they all have faith in the ship they're in. The Andrea Gail is 22 meters long and over 6 meters wide with a draft of 3 meters. It's got a 365 horsepower engine with a max speed of 12 knots. The Andrea Gail's a hefty ship, and with a length over 20 meters, it would probably take a wave bigger than 20 meters to topple it. Tyne and his crew continue in the storm, prepared to brave out the tough conditions. What they don't know is that the situation is going to get worse than they could probably ever imagine. A freak natural event is about to take place, and they're sailing into the most powerful storm for a century. The radio conversation Tyne has with his fellow captains is the last thing anyone will hear from the Andrea Gail. Their position at the time of their last transmission is 130 nautical miles east of Sable Island. No one knows exactly which direction the Andrea Gail is headed. Tyne may have been heading towards Nova Scotia to wait out the storm. Hurricane Grace has intensified. On the 29th of October, it reaches peak intensity. Satellites see an eye develop near Bermuda. Its speed of movement accelerates and it becomes a Category 2 hurricane. Meanwhile, the northern storm the Andrea Gail is in is changing as well. The high-pressure ridge over eastern Canada was forcing the storm southeast, but now it pushes west. The centers of the northern storm and the hurricane are separated by a large distance, but they're close together at the edge and moving towards each other. Bear in mind, the Andrea Gail is already in what experienced seamen regard as challenging sea conditions. A weather phenomenon is developing that only occurs every 50 to 100 years. The northern storm that the Andrea Gail is in and Hurricane Grace merge to create a storm with unbelievable intensity. The huge storms are combining, and the different temperatures and conditions of each storm creates an incredible pressure gradient with intense winds and exceptionally large waves. What will later become known as the perfect storm is forming right over the Andrea Gail. By the 30th of October, Hurricane Grace and the northern storm merge into one superstorm. Conditions at sea are dire. Weather buoys report sustained wind speeds over 50 knots with gusts up to 65 knots. They also report significant wave heights between 9 to 12 meters, interspersed with larger waves and towering rogue waves. One buoy 264 miles south of Halifax, Nova Scotia reports a wave of 30.7 meters. This is the biggest ever recorded wave on the oceanic shelf of Nova Scotia, the Scotian Shelf. A 30-meter wave could easily topple the 22-meter Andrea Gail. Waves breaking over the top of the ship could flood the deck. It's heavily loaded with a full catch along with fuel and water supplies. It's sailing low in the water, and the port bulwark that's been raised by 1 meter could trap more water on the deck, making the ship vulnerable to flooding. Over the 29th and 30th of October, the owner of the Andrea Gail, Bob Brown, tries to reach the ship by radio, but he doesn't get a response. At 18:15 on the 30th, he contacts the Coast Guard to log the Andrea Gail as unreported from a fishing trip. He tells them he fears the worst. There's no recorded communication from the Andrea Gail after the last conversation Tyne has with the other fishermen. No distress calls are received, and no signals are received from the ship's EPIRB. On the 31st of October, a search operation is launched. The Coast Guard Atlantic Area Operations Center in New York coordinates a huge multi-agency search effort that covers the area from the Grand Banks to Cape Cod in Massachusetts. 23 U.S. Coast Guard vessels, 8 U.S. Coast Guard aircraft, 3 U.S. Navy aircraft, 3 Canadian aircraft, and 1 U.S. Marine aircraft take part in the search, which lasts 10 days. By the 10th of November, the total searched area exceeds 109,000 square miles. The search is abandoned when the chances of anyone surviving are finally deemed too low. When the ship was last contacted, it was just over 100 nautical miles east of Sable Island. It may have traveled a long distance between the last contact and its sinking. A few items of debris are later found washed up on Sable Island, which suggests that this is the area the ship went down. One of the most important things found on Sable Island is the ship's EPIRB. It's found on the southwest side of the island, fully operational with the switch in the off position. We can't be certain if it was off when the ship went down, but it needs to be on to automatically activate if it comes free from its holster. It'll come free from its holster if the ship capsizes or sinks, or the crew can activate it manually if they need to. If the ship capsized or sank suddenly with its EPIRB turned off, no one would ever know. Another item cited during the search for the ship was a submerged orange cloth-like object that could have been a deflated life raft. The loss of the Andrea Gail meant the loss of family and friends for many people in the city of Gloucester. For Billy Tyne's sister Roberta, Billy was the second brother she had lost. Their other brother was killed in the Vietnam War. Roberta and Sully's sister Kathy sometimes have a drink at the Crow's Nest. Kathy Sullivan learned of her brother's disappearance through a friend who'd heard a rumor in town. She later said that she had videotaped the storm as it hit the shore because it was a beautiful sight, not having any idea what her brother was going through. To this day, the wreck of the Andrea Gail hasn't been found. No bodies of the crew have ever been recovered. Without being able to see the ship, it's hard to say exactly how it sank. Ultimately, it was the massive storm that caused the ship to be lost. It may be that the ship encountered a giant wave and was suddenly capsized. This would explain why no emergency signals were ever received. A 30-meter wave was recorded during the storm. The consistent 10-meter waves it experienced in the storm could have caused the ship to capsize or flood. If water couldn't escape the raised bulwark fast enough, then subsequent waves could compound the flooding. Perhaps the ship's seaworthiness was compromised by the modifications. It may have been unbalanced by the fuel tanks at the stern. It would also have been sailing low in the water with its full fish tanks and reserves of fuel and water. Another theory is that the storm muddied the fuel in the ship's tanks, which resulted in the engine failing at a crucial moment. It's easy to imagine what might have gone wrong. What's harder to imagine is what it must have been like for the crew when such a large storm formed right on top of them. The crew were lost to an unimaginable storm that only occurs once in a lifetime. You may have seen the movie The Perfect Storm, released in the year 2000. After the movie was released, a lot of people from the city of Gloucester, including friends and family of the Andrea Gail's crew, disputed the way Tyne and his men were presented in the film. It's quite common for movies to add some drama. Another well-known story I've covered is Deepwater Horizon, which was also made into a film you've probably seen. I'll leave a link to that video here. On the 10th of November 1975, the largest ship ever to sink on the Great Lakes slips beneath the waterline 15 nautical miles northwest of Whitefish Bay, Lake Superior, taking every one of its 29 crew with it. The investigation that follows leaves more questions than answers. One thing is certain, there is not one theory that everyone agrees on. And so you should read through the comments on this video to find more information and decide for yourself which is the most plausible explanation. In November 2023, I released a video on the Edmund Fitzgerald that I've since taken down. I focused on the official investigation, and you were quick to point out that there's a lot more to it. Thank you. I appreciate your input. I made some mistakes, and so I took it as a personal challenge to raise my game. It's impossible to be absolutely certain about the cause of this accident. But in this video, you'll learn what the possible contributing factors are, along with some of the strengths and weaknesses of those theories. I encourage you once again to share your perspective in the comments. Our story begins with Ernest McSorley, who was born in Canada. At 11 years old, he moved to the US with his father and stepmother. He spent his teenage years watching ships moving cargo up and down the St. Lawrence River from the Great Lakes to Montreal and Quebec. From a young age, he decided to join their ranks, and at 23, he started his career on the water. The Great Lakes are vast inland lakes. They're the largest freshwater system in the world, containing 80% of America's freshwater and 20% of the world's freshwater. Every year, 120 million tons of cargo are shipped across the Great Lakes. They're the arteries keeping heavy industry afloat, but these lakes are more dangerous than most would assume. They're home to an estimated 6,000 shipwrecks and the graves of nearly 30,000 sailors. At 729 feet long, the Edmund Fitzgerald is designed to be 1 foot less than the maximum limit on the Great Lakes. Construction begins on the 9th of August 1957 and differs from the usual manufacturing process of the time. Traditionally, construction begins by laying down a ship's keel and building the ship up from there. But the Edmund Fitzgerald's hull is built in bulkhead segments which are then joined together. This is one of the first times this style of assembly has ever been used and goes on to become the industry standard. On the 7th of June 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald is launched. At the time of its launch, it's the largest ship on the Great Lakes. It weighs 13,632 tons and is able to carry well over 25,000 tons. It has a crew of 29 and is driven by massive steam turbine engines that push it along at 14 knots. It's named after the president and CEO of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, Edmund Fitzgerald, who fits the bill for the $8.4 million ship. At the christening ceremony, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, Edmund's wife, tries to break the champagne bottle across the side of the Fitzgerald. It takes her 3 tries. In recent years, the traditional champagne christening bottle has been thinned down to make it easier to break and avoid the embarrassment and superstition of a failed attempt. As if to reinforce any superstition, it then takes over half an hour to release the ropes, and the ship slides down into the water at a dangerous angle, sending a huge wave crashing to the bank on the opposite side of the shore, drenching people who are watching the launch. In the crowd of almost 15,000 spectators, a 58-year-old man is said to have a heart attack and die on the scene. Superstition points to this series of events as a sign of bad luck for the vessel. Nonetheless, the ship is fitted out and goes into service. The massive steam powerhouse on board makes it one of the fastest freighters at the time. Its pilot house has the most advanced navigational and charting equipment for its time, as well as top-of-the-line radio and communication equipment. The interior fittings are lavish for a cargo ship. 2 guest staterooms, a guest lounge, comfortable captain's office and quarters, laundry room, recreational deck, and the crew staterooms are larger than industry standards. They also have a kitchen with all the amenities to provide meals to the 2 dining rooms on board. 1 luxury dining room for officers and wining and dining the company's guests, and another for the crew. The ship's leased by the Ogilvy Norton Mineral Company for a 25-year contract. On the 22nd of September 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald makes its maiden voyage, leaving its birthplace in Rouge River, Detroit, Michigan, and sailing to Silver Bay, Minnesota, to retrieve a load of taconite, iron ore. On its very first trip, it sets a Great Lakes tonnage record, the first of many records the ship will set. For well over 10 years, it remains the largest ship on the Great Lakes, carrying cargo loads previously thought to be impossible. Onlookers line up to watch the ship pass through locks and channels. It's nicknamed the Singing Ship because one of its captains, Peter Pulser, would play music on the megaphone to boost morale. He's also known to speak over the megaphone, sharing facts about the ship with onlookers as they passed through the docks. From new construction techniques to being the largest ship built, shaking off superstitions that plagued its launch, carrying bulk loads larger than any other ship, and a skipper with personality, Edmund Fitzgerald develops a reputation and legend that you could compare to SpaceX today. In 1971, 13 years after its maiden voyage, it's refitted from coal firing to oil firing, increasing its speed and endurance. In 1972, Ernest McSorley takes command of the Edmund Fitzgerald. McSorley's already had 9 ships under his command. While he's not at the helm of the Edmund Fitzgerald, he lives with his wife Nellie in Ottawa Hills, a leafy suburb of Ohio, just a stone's throw from Lake Erie, where he and Nellie raised Nellie's 3 children from a previous marriage. During the winter of 1973-74, the Fitzgerald comes out of the water for annual maintenance. Ex-Fitzgerald crew member George Bergner is at the shipyard one day when he overhears a conversation between a shipyard worker and an employee of the Ogilvy Mineral Company who owned the Fitzgerald. In a deposition later in life, Bergner says the conversation is about breaks in the welds that hold the keel in place and that the keel is loose. The Coast Guard know about the breaks in the welds and have approved minor repairs. Bergner also testifies about another conversation he heard between McSorley and crew members on the Fitzgerald. The crew members were digging mud out from the bottom of the Fitzgerald when they noticed the keel was loose again, and they told McSorley. McSorley's response, as Bergner puts it, was to say, "All the son of a bitch has to do is stay together for 1 more year. After that, I don't care what happens to it." McSorley is planning to retire after the season, and so the problem would transfer to the new captain. I'm going to call this the first theory of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. A cargo ship that's poorly maintained is an accident waiting to happen. If the keel was loose and there were structural problems, then it's possible a severe storm could exacerbate those weak points, causing the Fitzgerald to break apart and sink. The Fitzgerald's sister ship, the Arthur Homer, will later be laid up permanently in 1980 for a structural deficiency, possibly pointing to a similar problem. But now it's 1975 and the Edmund Fitzgerald is in its prime, still in its initial 25-year contract and not even a third of the way through its expected service life. On the 9th of November 1975 at 08:30, Edmund Fitzgerald is moored at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock. It begins loading over 26,000 tons of taconite for a trip from Superior, Wisconsin, across Lake Superior and south to Zug Island on the Detroit River. The process of loading is lengthy, as it always is. Towards the end of the season, the Fitz is trying to deliver as much cargo as it can before the winter weather closes in. The loading foreman and deck boss work in tandem to ensure the proper distribution of ore throughout the massive ship's hull. Too much on one side or the other would risk capsizing the ship. Too much along the center line and it could drag its belly out of the port or worse, break its back. Something that's destroyed several ships before it. This could be referred to as the second theory of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. If the ship is pushing the limits of its cargo capacity, that reduces its freeboard. Freeboard is the volume of spare capacity. A ship always needs some freeboard or it would sink. All ships have a specific freeboard they shouldn't go over. If the Fitzgerald is overloaded, then that reduces its freeboard, and under normal weather conditions, it might not matter. The National Weather Service has been tracking a large November storm, but predicts it will pass south of Lake Superior. By 14:15, 6 hours later, the crew hauls in the shorelines and Edmund Fitzgerald departs Lake Superior en route to Detroit with 26,116 tons of taconite pellets. After loading, the crew on the Fitzgerald fasten the hatch covers on deck, sealing the cargo holds. Some hatch covers have seen better days, but overall, they're in good working order. As they pass out the breakwater, Janice Armagust and her 2 children stand on the shore. The children are hoping to catch a glimpse of their dad, Michael Armagust, the 3rd mate. He's not on deck. Janice yells to a deckhand asking where Mike is, and he responds that Mike's below deck. Janice and the children wave goodbye to the ship and watch as it sails out onto Lake Superior. The deckhand continues to go around and fasten deck hatches as needed for the calm weather of the day. Deck hatches is the third theory for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. As with all the theories of why the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, the deck hatch theory is heavily debated. In many photographs of the Edmund Fitzgerald, not all the hatch dogs are secure. This has led some to believe that it's common practice not to secure all the dogs while underway. On the one hand, not all photographs are taken when the ship is sailing, and so how would we know if it's common practice to leave them undogged when the ship is underway? On the other hand, captains of other ships have used the same types of hatch covers and dogs without them failing because the weight of the hatch cover itself is actually enough to seal the hatch, even if a few hatch dogs aren't secure. It's also possibly in the interest of the ship's owners to shift the blame to the crew members in order to secure the insurance payout. There are two main questions. Were all the hatch dogs secure? And if they weren't secure, would that have allowed enough water into the hull to sink the ship? On board the Edmund Fitzgerald, all is going well as they sail into the late afternoon. Unexpectedly, the barometer quickly drops and it becomes clear that the storm will hit Lake Superior. At 16:30, another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, departs Two Harbors, Minnesota, just ahead of the Edmund Fitzgerald and on a parallel course. At the time of its construction, the slightly older Anderson is shorter than Fitzgerald. After a refit, it's lengthened to be slightly longer than the Fitzgerald, but notably slower. Edmund Fitzgerald soon closes the lead that the Anderson has. By midnight, the two ships are within range of each other and begin to communicate. Both ships are fitted with weather observation and reporting equipment used by the National Weather Service. The two skippers decide to hug the Canadian shore to shelter from the storm. As they track the storm, they realize it'll catch them before they reach the safety of Whitefish Bay. Being the faster ship, Edmund Fitzgerald passes the Anderson, but both ships are within radio and radar range, and so they speak regularly about the deteriorating weather. The wind has picked up to 40 knots and waves are easily 10 to 12 feet in height. The captain of the Anderson, Bernie Cooper, contacts the Fitzgerald and shares his prediction that once the storm progresses, the wind will likely shift by 180 degrees. As day breaks, the ships approach the islands outside of Whitefish Bay. By 1400, the ships have passed through the eye of the storm, and as predicted, the wind shifts from southerly to northerly, blowing at a strong 42 knots. Snow begins to fall heavily on the lake. The Anderson loses sight of the Fitzgerald. As conditions worsen, they can only see each other on radar. Right here, the story starts to take diverging courses. These scenarios could be viewed in isolation or in combination with one another. Everyone knows the story and has an opinion, and each is valid. My best guess is that the exact cause of the sinking is not one, but a combination of causes. But which combination? At 1500, the Anderson's Captain Cooper brings the ship further to the east to avoid the 6-fathom shoal. Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald doesn't follow the Anderson into deeper water. Under normal conditions, the 6-fathom shoal is about 36 feet deep. The loaded draft of the Anderson is around 26 feet. The draft of a ship is the depth of the keel below the waterline. The Fitzgerald's draft is 25 feet under normal load. It's always a good idea to avoid shallow shoals, particularly in bad weather. If the Fitzgerald hits the shoal, it could damage the integrity of the ship. In combination with a heavy load and bad weather, they could potentially break apart. At 15:30, Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald radios the Anderson and says that they've lost a railing on the deck as well as a few vent covers. They're taking on water. This looks to me like the fourth theory to explain the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. McSorley says he's reducing speed so that the Anderson can catch up. Captain Cooper acknowledges, then asks if the pumps are on, and Captain McSorley confirms they're both running. The Anderson is now 17 nautical miles behind the Fitzgerald. Both ships are about 4 or 5 hours from the safety of Whitefish Bay. Between 1530 and 1620, Captain Cooper watches his radar as the Fitzgerald sails further towards the 6-fathom shoal, then passes directly over it. 6-fathom shoal is well known by local skippers, but the depths are not very well documented on the chart. In fact, there are discrepancies between Canadian and American charts at the time. It's possible the Fitzgerald scrapes its hull on the shoal, and in the heavy weather, a wave hits the ship at the same time, disguising the contact with the shoal. This is theory number 5 for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. At 16:20, less than an hour after their last contact, the Anderson receives another call from the Fitzgerald. Captain McSorley says that both his radars aren't working and he's driving blind. He asks Captain Cooper if he can assist in navigating using the Anderson's radar. Captain McSorley doesn't mention to the Anderson that they ran aground or scraped the shoal, and he continues to sail the ship into deeper water after passing over the shoal. During the investigation after the Fitzgerald sinks, many engineers and experts are interviewed. All the expert witnesses agreed that the Fitzgerald would have sunk quickly if it had made contact with the shoal. None of the experts at the time thought the ship would have been able to continue sailing as far as it did. I've been on a boat navigating sandbanks, and we made light contact with the ground. I know it's a different scale, but when we made contact, I could feel the shudder and a distinct drop in momentum as it made contact. I would think an experienced captain like McSorley would also notice and report if he'd made contact with the shoal. There are several forums that refer to divers who found red paint on the shoal, but no matter how hard I searched for an original quote, I could only find comments in forums and not an original article about that claim. I did find articles about the official search of the shoals that found no evidence of grounding on the shoal. By 16:30, it's getting dark, and along with the snow, visibility might as well be zero. The winds are 58 knots from the north. At 1700, Captain Cooper on the Anderson radios to say they're 15 nautical miles astern of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's taken 1.5 hours to close 2 nautical miles. They're still assisting with navigation using their radar as they slowly close the distance. At 17:20, Captain McSorley calls the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais, Michigan. He's trying to get a fix off the beacon at Whitefish Point, but isn't picking up the signal. Without his radar and with such low visibility, this is one of his only ways of navigating. A Great Lakes registered pilot is on board the Swedish vessel Avafors heading north from Whitefish Point. He replies to the Fitzgerald to say that Whitefish Point Light is operating, but the radio beacon is not working. The Fitzgerald is navigating with very little information. The radio channel remains open for a moment, and the pilot aboard Avafors overhears the Fitzgerald master say to the crew, "Don't allow nobody on deck," followed by some conversation about a vent, which isn't clear. The Fitzgerald's master then tells the Avafors that the Fitzgerald has a bad list, has lost both radars, and is taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he's ever encountered. The list confirms that the Fitzgerald has already taken on water. It could be that the keel has separated and the faulty welds are letting water in from below the waterline. Perhaps the deck hatches aren't secure and water has found its way into the cargo hatches, which are possibly carrying more load than is safe in these conditions. The damaged vent cover could have let in enough water to make the ship list. Or maybe the Fitzgerald has run aground and torn a hole in its hull, allowing water to seep in. Now we come to the 6th theory of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The seas are growing, with 25-foot waves crashing over the decks of both the Anderson and the Fitzgerald. A phenomenon known as the Three Sisters is reported near the locations of Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur Anderson. A series of at least 2, possibly 3, larger than normal rogue waves hits the 2 ships. Captain Cooper on the Anderson records 2 waves that are around 30 to 35 feet at 1900. He notes in his ship's log that the wave action has caused damage to the deck gear on his ship. It's possible that the first wave floods the deck of the Fitzgerald with a large amount of water. If it's not completely drained before the second wave hits, it could drive the bow under. Or it's possible that the Fitzgerald rides high, straddles either one or two waves, and flexes mid-ship, splitting the ship and causing it to sink quickly. At 1900, the Fitzgerald is only about an hour from the safety of Whitefish Bay. The first mate on the Anderson calls Captain McSorley to inform him that the Fitzgerald is approximately 10 nautical miles ahead and about 15 nautical miles from Whitefish Bay. 10 minutes later, at 1910, the Anderson picks up a contact on its radar further to the south. He calls McSorley and says there is a target 9 miles ahead. A target on radar is another vessel. McSorley asks if he's going to clear, to which the mate responds, yes, he's going to pass to the west of you. The Fitzgerald responds with a simple, well, fine. The mate then asks, how are you holding out with your problems? And McSorley says, we are holding our own. There are two areas of high wind over Lake Superior with speeds exceeding 43 and 40 knots. The southeastern part of the lake, where the Fitzgerald is, experiences the highest winds. The waves are nearly 20 feet high with winds over 50 miles per hour. The Edmund Fitzgerald is on the eastern edge of the high wind area. Captain Cooper on the Anderson records northwest winds of 57 miles per hour with gusts up to 86 miles per hour. Conditions are treacherous. Then the snow subsides and visibility opens up significantly. The crew on the Anderson searches for the lights of the Fitzgerald but can't see them. Captain Cooper worries that the Fitzgerald has lost power and tells his crew to look for a silhouette. At 19:20, only 10 minutes after their last radio call, the Anderson's radar is picking up 3 targets, but not the Edmund Fitzgerald. Captain Cooper calls the Fitzgerald over the radio with no response. He calls again. Soon after, he calls the Coast Guard station to report his loss of radio contact with the Fitzgerald. An hour later, at 20:32, Cooper calls the Coast Guard again, saying he is very concerned about the safety of the Fitzgerald. At 2100, almost 2 hours after their last contact, the Anderson officially declares the Fitzgerald missing. The Coast Guard initiates a search. They contact Rescue Coordination Center Cleveland, Ohio, who dispatches a search and rescue aircraft from Traverse City. Then they ask ships in the area to look for the Fitzgerald. More than one ship is asked to alter course or double back to search the last known location of the Fitzgerald. But they decline because of the risk to their ship and crew, which is their first priority. The Coast Guard don't immediately dispatch a search and rescue boat because of the high winds and rough seas. They ask Captain Cooper on the Anderson to come about and conduct a search. Captain Cooper is hesitant. He's concerned that the Fitzgerald has been lost to the storm his crew have just survived. After some convincing, he reluctantly agrees and turns the Anderson around to sail back into the storm to search for the Fitzgerald. Night turns to day. At 0800 the next morning, the Anderson spots a piece of lifeboat, then another. Aircraft and rescue vessels join to search a vast area, but none of the 29 crew members are found, dead or alive. They find pieces of life jackets, oars, a lifeboat, air tanks, and a heaving line, but no personal effects and no bodies. The damage to the lifeboats indicates they were wrenched from the ship. They weren't launched. A few days later, on the 14th of November, a side scan sonar identifies 2 large objects on the bottom of Lake Superior. They scan it several times but can't determine if it's the Fitzgerald. The search is called off. In May of the following year, the Navy brings out their Curve 3 underwater ROV equipped with an underwater camera. They get visual confirmation that the wreck is in fact the Edmund Fitzgerald. Sitting at the bottom in 530 feet of water, it's split into 2 sections, with an enormous debris field spread out between the 2 sections. They don't find any bodies. Based on the Curve 3 survey, the National Transportation Safety Board notes damage and missing components across different hatch covers, including signs of external pressure fractures. This looks like wave action could potentially have caved in a hatch. It wasn't until 1994 that the body of a crew member was discovered near the bow in the ship. Unfortunately, the body was not identifiable. After an accident like this, each group of people would like to assign blame to someone else. The insurance company would like to assign blame to the ship's owners so that they can reduce the amount they pay out. The ship's owners would like to avoid blame for poor maintenance or endorsing overloading so that the insurance company pays in full. The families of the sailors don't want to see their loved ones take the blame for something like not fastening deck hatches. And the Coast Guard don't want to be criticized for not sending ships out to search immediately or possibly missing the opportunity to insist on more thorough welding during maintenance inspections. But one thing is certain, the weather played the most significant role. If you remove the weather from the equation, it's unlikely the Fitzgerald would have sank on this voyage. But the rough sea and large waves combined forces with one or more contributing factors. In 2005, the Ontario Heritage Act declared the site a burial ground, which means nobody can go back and dive there to gather more information about the wreck. 6 Fathoms Shoal was later found to be 1 mile further north than the American charts in circulation at the time. The Arthur M. Anderson is still in service today. Which do you believe is to blame? A heavy load, structural weakness, vent covers or deck hatches that allowed water in, grounding on an uncharted shoal, or braking over large waves? Let me know in the comments. In 1968, after completing a clandestine mission in the Atlantic, US submarine Scorpion checks in with its command center and charts a course for home. 5 days later, the family of the crew waits on the dock for the submarine to arrive home. It never does. The USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear-powered submarine that served in the United States Navy in the 1960s. It was the first of its class to combine nuclear propulsion with the advanced hull design of a diesel-powered submarine. Skipjacks were the fastest attack submarines of their time, with speeds up to 33 knots. It was quick, maneuverable, and could dive as deep as 220 meters. Although the skipjacks demonstrated superior speed and handling, they were also loud. Propulsion and machinery noises transferred directly through the hull. The low-frequency sounds could be recorded by the new SOSUS array of sound surveillance systems developed by the US Navy. SOSUS consists of a network of acoustic sensors or hydrophone arrays that use a sound channel to detect submarines and other underwater acoustic events at distances of hundreds of miles by listening to the low-frequency sounds they generate. The sound channel is a horizontal layer of water in the ocean. Sound waves emitted underwater bounce between the upper and lower layer in the channel, allowing low-frequency sound to travel great distances with minimal loss of energy. The low-frequency sound picked up by the hydrophone arrays are recorded and transmitted to a shore station for analysis. The source of the signal can be triangulated using 3 or more hydrophone arrays in different locations. The early warning surveillance system led to the development of the quieter, larger, and deeper diving Thresher and Hermit-class submarines. This new class of submarine had sound deadening technology to make it stealthy, along with other improvements. Unfortunately, the skipjacks couldn't be modified or upgraded with advanced silencing features. They had a 65-ton TLX-53A main storage battery manufactured by Gould National Battery Incorporated. The battery released more hydrogen when charged compared to its predecessor, the TLX-53, used by a diesel submarine. But that was an acceptable compromise because the skipjack nuclear submarine only used one battery and had the ability to eliminate the gas. The diesel submarine, like the Greyback class, used 4 TLX-53 batteries. Another innovation on the skipjacks were the combination of the conning tower, control room, and attack center in one space. Combining the functions in the operations compartment made it possible to use push-button ballast control. The push-button electrical system operated the valves hydraulically from the control room. The overall layout made coordination of the weapons and ship control systems easier during combat operations. For weapons, the skipjacks were equipped with Mark 37 torpedoes with a 150 kilogram warhead and a homing sonar to automatically seek out targets. Their hull was incredibly strong and made from HY80 high-strength steel with a crush depth of 550 meters, meaning they could dive to 550 meters before they implode. After the loss of the USS Thresher in April 1963, the Navy created the SubSafe Submarine Safety Program to correct, maintain, and build a safe and effective nuclear-powered submarine fleet. Under this program, the Scorpion was set to receive 2 new safety systems during its full overhaul starting in June 1963. The first is an emergency seawater shutoff valve and an emergency blow system. But this was deferred until its next scheduled overhaul in 1967. With the onset of the Cold War and the ongoing war in Vietnam, the military's resources were stretched to the limit. To complicate things, a Naval Sea Systems command study revealed that 40% of the submarine's time was spent in the dry dock, leaving only 60% of its time in active duty. This worried the Navy leadership, who felt that politicians may not support the nuclear submarine program if it were inefficient. So the Navy created an experimental planned or reduced availability overhaul concept in the submarine fleet. The program's aim was to save on the repair costs and increase the submarine's time on active duty. The Scorpion was one of those entered into the program. On the 1st of February 1967, the Scorpion began its reduced availability overhaul. The Scorpion sailed out of the dry dock on the 6th of October after having the cheapest submarine overhaul in the US Navy's history. Out of the $3.2 million spent on the Scorpion during its 8-month overhaul, $2.3 million went into refueling and altering its reactor. This is 84% less than the standard submarine overhaul of this class, which lasted almost 2 years and cost more than $20 million. The Scorpion had 109 incomplete work orders, including a new latch on the trash disposal unit, the 2 safety system upgrades, and repairs to the hydraulic stern and sail planes. On the 23rd of March 1968, Commander Slattery drafted an emergency request for repairs. He cited the poor state of the hull, which had 317 internal well defects, and a series of leaking valves that restricted Scorpion's operating depth to 91 meters, which is 61 meters shallower than the new SubSafe regulations. This earned the submarine the nickname USS Scrap Iron. The first quarter of 1968 is eventful for the world's navies. Israel, France, and the Soviets have each lost a submarine in mysterious circumstances. The most recent is the Soviet ballistic missile submarine, the K-129, which has vanished in the Pacific. This is at the height of the Cold War, and the US is trying to gather information on its adversaries. The USS Pueblo is seized by the North Korean Navy somewhere near the territorial waters of the Korean Peninsula. The spy ship is fully equipped with surveillance and monitoring instruments, including the US Navy's encoding device, the TSAC KW-7. On the 15th of February 1968, the USS Scorpion completes its refresher training with a new commanding officer, Commander Francis Slattery, and its crew of 100 men set off for a Mediterranean Sea deployment. In the Mediterranean, the Scorpion completes 2 NATO naval exercises and trains again with the US Navy's 6th Fleet. During the long deployment, the Scorpion suffers various mechanical malfunctions, including a freon leak from the cooling system and an electrical fire in an escape trunk, when a water leak shorts out the connection to shore power. After completing its Mediterranean deployment in May, the Scorpion heads west through the Med on its way to the Atlantic. As it transits through the Mediterranean, 1 man on board falls ill and another man has a family emergency at home, which is reported to Commander Slattery. The Scorpion passes through the Straits of Gibraltar and then heads to Naval Station Rota in Spain. On the night of the 16th of May, the Scorpion transfers the 2 men to another vessel outside the breakwater at Naval Station Rota. On the 17th of May, the commander of the US Submarine Force Atlantic, Vice Admiral Arnold F. Schrader, who's based in Virginia, takes operational control of the Scorpion. This is the Cold War, and the crew of Scorpion have 2 more jobs to do before they return home to Norfolk. The first job is easy. US and Allied ballistic missile submarines operate from Naval Station Rota. They come in for supplies and repairs, then go back out on patrol. The Soviets know this. Soviet submarines try to follow Allied submarines as they leave Rota. While the Scorpion is at Rota, there are Soviet hunter-killer submarines and spy ships waiting outside the base. The first job for the Scorpion is to provide noise cover for the USS John C. Calhoun on its way out of Naval Station Rota. Noise cover is when a submarine creates noise to cover up the sounds of another submarine, so it can go undetected. Early in the day, both submarines depart for the Atlantic. The USS John C. Calhoun slips stealthily into the Atlantic armed with nuclear warheads. The Scorpion makes a more obvious entry into the seas on a path towards home. Scorpion now has a far more difficult, dangerous, and complicated task. There's a Soviet naval task force operating somewhere near the Azores archipelago, and the Scorpion is ordered to infiltrate the Soviet fleet and gather intelligence. There will almost certainly be Soviet fast attack submarines guarding the task force from submarines like the Scorpion. They sail the Scorpion as silently as possible while they hunt for enemy submarines. The torpedo crew loads the Mark 37 homing torpedoes ready to fire if needed. After the Scorpion heads off towards the Azores, its movements become unclear. During the operation, an order is given to keep electronic silence except for a few particular circumstances. There's little, if any, communication with the Scorpion until it's away from the Soviets, and it's a classified operation. All we know is that the Scorpion sails towards the Soviet task force. Naval Station Rota to the Azores is about 1,100 miles, and with the Scorpion capable of traveling over 30 miles per hour, it probably takes over 30 hours to get there. Leaving Rota early on the 17th would put the Scorpion around the Azores between morning and lunchtime on the 18th. It probably spent 2 days spying on the Soviet task force. Then, from just before midnight on the 20th of May until sometime after midnight, Commander Slattery tries to get through to Naval Station Rota on the radio. He can't reach radio operators at Rota, but he gets through to a Navy communication station in Greece. Operators there forward Commander Slattery's message to Vice Admiral Schrader, the commander of the US Submarine Force Atlantic in Virginia. In reply, he assigns the Scorpion a route back to its home port in Norfolk, Virginia, and asks Commander Slattery to provide an ETA. On the 21st of May at 23:54, Slattery gives a planned course of 290 degrees and a speed of 18 knots with an ETA of 1700 on the 27th of May. They've finished their mission and are now heading home. And that's the last time anyone hears from Scorpion. Between the 22nd and the 29th of May, the US Navy broadcast 9 messages to the Scorpion. 3 messages specifically request a reply, but none comes. On the 27th, the families of those on board are anticipating the arrival of their loved ones. The Scorpion still doesn't radio into base as it should before it comes in. The submarine doesn't arrive home. From the 28th to the 30th of May, the US Navy Atlantic Fleet launches a sea and air search. 55 ships and 35 search aircraft take part. They don't find any signs of the Scorpion. On the 5th of June, the Scorpion is presumed lost. On the 30th of June, its name is struck from the US Naval Vessel Register. The Scorpion becomes another mystery, and several theories begin to formulate about what has happened to the Scorpion. Of course, the Scorpion was spying on the Soviet fleet, and so it seems logical that the Soviet Navy sank the Scorpion. The US Navy is aware of the encoding device falling into the hands of the Soviets during the USS Pueblo incident. During the Cold War, it's possible that state secrets were sold that would allow the Soviets to decode messages about Scorpion's location. 11 weeks earlier, the Soviets lost a ballistic missile submarine, the K-129, under suspicious circumstances. It's possible the Soviets believe the US is behind the sinking and retaliate on the Scorpion. As the Scorpion monitors the Soviet task force, it's ambushed by a Soviet submarine. The Scorpion takes a hit from a torpedo and sinks. These theories were later turned into fiction books with fantastic action scenes and plots involving spies and secrets. The lead investigator on the incident, John Craven, develops his own theories to investigate around the Scorpion's torpedoes. His first theory is that the Scorpion's Mark 37 torpedo accidentally arms and begins running in its launch tube, which has happened before. Perhaps Commander Slattery orders the torpedo to be launched to prevent it firing inside the submarine. As the torpedo exits the submarine, its homing device looks for the nearest target, which is the Scorpion itself. As the torpedo strikes the Scorpion's bow, the damage causes the bow of the submarine to fill with water. The water drags the submarine front first towards the bottom of the ocean, and at crush depth, the rest of the submarine implodes. Craven's second theory to investigate is that the battery inside a Mark 37 torpedo ruptures and overheats, creating enough heat for a torpedo to explode. As it explodes inside the bow, the front hatch is blown off. This floods the torpedo room, dragging the Scorpion down to crush depth. Months after Scorpion disappears, the Navy releases the SOSUS recordings with the sound of the destruction of Scorpion. On the 22nd of May at 1837, a hydrophone array at La Palma Island in the Canary Islands records two sharp, short signals half a second apart. The strength of the signal is consistent with two explosions equivalent to 9 kilograms of TNT. But these two bursts of energy are so small that nobody sees them in the data. 21 minutes later, at 1859, La Palma picks up a signal equivalent to a 6.6 kiloton explosion of TNT at a depth of 466 meters. This powerful signal is followed by more than 14 sharp, major acoustic signals over a period of almost 3 minutes. These strong acoustic signals are also picked up by two other SOSUS hydrophone arrays in the Grand Banks area of Newfoundland. The first two small explosions aren't noticed yet, but the larger acoustic signals are interpreted as a major implosion followed by several smaller implosions. What the SOSUS recordings don't show are the sound of any other submarines in the area, which suggests that the Soviets weren't involved. And a Mark 37 torpedo has 150 kilograms of explosives, which doesn't show up in the SOSUS recordings. So the torpedo theories don't seem to stand up either. Another theory about the trash disposal unit develops. The Scorpion ascends to periscope depth to blow out sewage and dump rubbish. The latch on the trash disposal unit malfunctions and allows water in, which floods the vessel. This should have been repaired, but was one of the work orders left out during the reduced maintenance schedule. With no emergency seawater shutoff valve in place, a safety feature not installed during the reduced maintenance program, floods and sinks the vessel. The Navy uses the recordings from SOSUS to locate the Scorpion, similar to how they located the USS Thresher. Acoustic signals are collected from the different SOSUS stations and the position of Scorpion is triangulated. The Navy combs a target area of 10 to 12 nautical miles searching for the Scorpion. They use a camera that can photograph an area 9 meters wide to search the ocean floor 3,000 meters deep in poor visibility. Late in October 1968, the Navy's oceanographic research ship, the Miser, finds the Scorpion inside an ancient undersea volcanic crater about 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. The stern section with the engine room has collapsed and it's been sucked forward into the reactor compartment area. The main shaft with the propeller still attached is separated from the stern section, lying in the debris field of the wreck site. The middle section, where the operations compartment is located, has completely disintegrated. The bow, where the torpedo room is located, is deformed by the incredible water pressure, 3,384 meters deep. The submarine is broken apart on the silty ocean floor. The sail of the submarine is sheared off. The bow section is embedded deep in the silt in an upright position. The stern section rests on its starboard side. The submersible vessel Trieste 2 documents the wreckage of Scorpion, and investigators start to compare the SOSUS data with what they can see. Trieste 2 also recovers pieces of the wreckage from the Scorpion with its robotic arm. The submersible's crew notice there's a lot of main battery debris in the operations compartment. They recover a section of the main battery cover with the robotic arm. Then they see a body in coveralls from the nuclear power crew midway between the bow and aft section. The wreck shows no sign of torpedo damage, which supports the idea that the Soviets weren't involved, nor that one of Scorpion's torpedoes exploded. And the extent of the implosion shows that the wreck wasn't flooded when it sank. If it had flooded, then the water inside the submarine would prevent it from imploding. Implosion only happens when there's an air pocket that's compressed by the pressure of the water. So what really happened? On the 31st of January 1969, the Scorpion Court of Inquiry released the findings of the investigation. They rule out sabotage, but the report says it can't pinpoint the cause of the accident. A Navy task force continues its own investigation with experts in the field of submarine design, submarine structures, and the effects of underwater explosions. In January 1970, the Scorpion Structural Analysis Group delivered their findings. They proposed that hydrogen gas caused an explosion in the main battery storage. The main battery cover recovered from the wreck is deformed from the inside, and it's got battery fragments embedded so deep that it must have come from a high-velocity explosion, like fragments flying through the air, and not through water, which would slow them down. The battery's dry during the explosion, meaning the compartment isn't flooded. The Scorpion Court of Inquiry dismissed their battery explosion theory. The court leans more towards Craven's theory of a torpedo explosion inside the hull. But there isn't enough evidence to paint a clear picture either way. And so the investigation stalls with no new evidence and starts to gather dust. 44 years after the incident, old evidence with the help of new technology starts to shed some light on what actually happened. In 2011, Bruce Rule, the lead acoustic analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence, publishes a technical report using evidence from the Structural Analysis Task Force and a 3-minute tape recording of acoustic signals recorded by SOSUS in La Palma, the two short, sharp explosions that went undetected for 40 years. Of course, this is still a theory that can't be proven, but it's the one that makes the most sense to me. The Scorpion is at periscope depth. The crew follows the old procedure in diesel submarines known as condition Baker. They close hatches and close ventilation ducts known as flappers in the battery compartment to prevent the battery flooding if they collide with a ship at the surface. In nuclear submarines, batteries can be charged even when the submarine is fully submerged. The battery charging generates hydrogen gas, which builds up and can be flammable or explosive at high enough concentrations. To prevent a buildup, the crew normally circulates the gas throughout the submarine, which dilutes the concentration, and a scrubber absorbs and processes the gas. During condition Baker, the battery room is sealed and air can't circulate, so hydrogen builds up quickly to dangerous levels. While the batteries are charging under condition Baker, a crew working inside the battery compartment triggers a static electricity spark that ignites the hydrogen. Two explosions occur half a second apart. The strength of the explosions are equivalent to 9 kilograms of TNT. The pressure from the explosion inside the hull is between 10 and 14 bar. Not enough to rupture the hull of the Scorpion, but 3.5 bars of pressure is enough to kill anyone in the nearest compartments. The explosion instantly kills or incapacitates the crew in the operations compartment and destroys the submarine's controls, including the ballast control. Fire breaks out and water slowly leaks through the damaged valves and hull. Not enough to flood the vessel, only enough to add weight so it slowly sinks. At the spaces aft of the reactor compartment, the blast is weaker and the crew possibly survive. There's nothing they can do but wait. At 1842, 21 minutes after the battery explosion, the main hull of the Scorpion implodes at a depth of 466 meters with a force equivalent to 6.6 kilotons of TNT. More than 14 smaller acoustic forces are recorded over 3 minutes as different compartments implode. All of the 99 crew are lost. After the tragedy, the Navy quietly dropped the reduced availability maintenance program. In an article published by the Houston Chronicle, the Naval Sea Systems Command said it had no record of any such maintenance program. It reads, "The success of this major minor overhaul concept depends essentially on the results of our first case at hand, Scorpion." The US Naval Ships Command issued a change in the Navy Ship's Technical Manual 10 months after the USS Scorpion was lost. Related to submarine storage batteries, the March 1969 edition says, "Do not enter the battery well of ships having open tank ventilation systems while a charge is in progress." It goes on to say, "Experience has shown that all individual battery cell explosions have occurred while personnel were working in the battery tank during charge." After 45 years, the Navy hadn't released conclusive findings on the USS Scorpion. In November 2012, the US Submarine Veterans, an organization with over 13,800 members, asked the US Navy to reopen the investigation of the sinking of the USS Scorpion. The Navy rejected the request.